We have talked about the importance of planning for your funeral plenty of times on this show, but what about the period that can come just before that in terms of needing care in later life? The average cost for a residential care home is over £40,000 a year. Places are few and far between, and home care is even more expensive and less available. So it's clear we all do need to prepare for our care in terms of both the finances and the logistics. But how many of us have had that conversation with our other half? I know that I haven't. We asked you if you've had the care home chat with your partner. 85% said no. Gloria, are you surprised by that result, that 85% of people have just not had that conversation?
I am in a way. But I haven't really had a big conversation with Stephen about it. I think I took the decision myself, which I sometimes do. And I have ring-fenced some money because I think you do have to plan ahead a bit. Because if you're in a care home... But by the way, I want to preface it by saying I never want to be in a care home, but I do understand it depends how your medicals end up. And people who are in care homes are there for a very good reason.
But you have that feeling that you don't want to be in a care home?
I don't know. I think my mum must have taken me when I was very young. I've always had that feeling from about this size. I want to say up front, though, you have to be very careful when you talk about care homes because there are some very, very good ones and there are some that are very, very mediocre. And we all accept that. But I went to live in a care home once, despite my worry about being in one. It was part of a documentary and I had to live it for real. I had to take my own bedding, had to take my photographs, put them around the room, take personal things. And it really... At the end of the week, I have to say I wanted to be in it less and less because there was absolutely no stimulation. And, of course, I'm assuming that if you're in and you're reasonably with it and you're not suffering from dementia or something, or some very, very bad disease, I do think that people in care homes need stimulation. And when I was in, it was a very, very nice home. I have to say it was a lovely home. But there was only a poetry class every 3 weeks. And, you know, you look at it, you just think, why? And there was a lovely gentleman who actually was in a wheelchair, but otherwise he was very fit and very mentally very aware. And it turned out when I talked to him that he was a photographer of old and published books. He hadn't been out in the fresh air for months and he would love to take the photographs. So because we had a camera with us, of course, we got permission to take him out in a chair one day and he got to do his photographs and things. And he was just a different man.
Yeah.
So I do know, though, and some people would get in touch and say, my mum's in a care home and believe me, there is stimulation and games and different things. They all differ. But I think, and I think the government some time back were edging towards more care in the home. And through our own Foundation for Karen, I noticed that more and more hospices are leaning towards hospice at home. And that's in an ideal world, if I wasn't too ill or something like that, that's what I would like to do. That's why I ring-fence money to pay for it, if that
we did that with we did that with Dad.
Kind of £25 an hour home care.
Exactly.
Generally. So, I mean, it's a lot of money.
We were lucky to have that option to do that with Dad. So 2021, when we lost him, obviously the year preceding that, when he was poorly, Lincoln and I took him out of hospital. It was a disaster everywhere. COVID was happening. You couldn't... It was just awful. And I felt he was safer with us. And we took him out. And it was one of the most joyous and wonderful periods of my life to have the honour to... I still cannot talk about that. To look after my dad and for my husband to love my dad enough to look after him. And we would have had him there forever. But his desire, much as he was very happy with us, was to go back to his own house. So Jane Moore, actually, our friend Jane, suggested at-home care. And we got this wonderful lady who came over from Poland, Ella, and she moved in with him. And Debbie and I were still very active in our care. But Ella was there with him for 6 weeks, and it worked out. Obviously, we had to have somebody younger, because somebody older, because we didn't want Dad to fancy her. So we thought that if she was over 60...
So what was the age?
Quite safe. She was over 60. I mean, Dad was obviously 84, but under 60 would have been a worry. So, but she was absolutely fantastic. But in light of what you said, I also had a relative in a council-run care home, and it was so awful. She faced the wall, she was left all day, and she died 6 weeks after she went in. On the other hand, a lady called Helen Rook, who I met in the COVID times, had got in touch when we were all doing everything by Zoom. And she worked in a care home in the south of England and said, look, we've got some of the ladies here are great fans of Loose Women. Would you judge the Easter bonnet competition? So I'd go online. It became a monthly thing that they'd have an art competition or this or that. And that was them against people making their rules who never visited the care home. That's often the managers, the trusts, making life hell on earth for them. But they did what they could to provide a wonderful, stimulating atmosphere for those for those people.
Can I just say at this point, on the back of everything you've said, I want to say well done to all the carers at home, all the carers in hospitals, all the carers in hospices. They do a really dedicated job, but sometimes there just isn't enough staff.
And you're right. And we have to remember there's 5 million, I think, roughly unpaid carers who are out there doing their very best to look after their loved ones. You know, whether it's to keep them out of a home or for whatever reason, and they've put their own lives on hold.
You said something in the beginning was sad to hear that there isn't enough facilities for couples, because I think that some of the videos that will stay in our minds forever, again, in COVID times for that reason, was couples being separated at that time of their lives. It's horrendous, and I cannot imagine the thought of that happening.
But you know what
to people
happens sometimes? Because I know 2 couples who are in homes at the moment, and they have separate bedrooms, side by side, but separate rooms, because there are medical issues or snoring.
That's understandable.
You know, so I think that happens quite a lot.
Yeah. Have you thought about it, Kelly? I mean, you're obviously a bit younger than the rest of us here.
Only a little bit, unfortunately. No, I think the whole conversation about death, I think I definitely have. I know that's a priority in our family. We talk about it, and I was so pleased to do with my mum. But with the care system, no. I mean, I've had both sides. I've had my nan wasn't looked after, but then on reflection, it was what you said about the carers. They're getting paid hardly anything to be there. There wasn't enough of them at the care home, and so some of the patients were left in a state, and that really affected me. But I also look at it as, if you think about care and going in at this age, you'd either want to go in knowing that you've got all your faculties and that you had freedom to still be you and to live the life that you've lived. You just might need support. But when you go into care homes sometimes, you feel like they're just left to fester. It's almost like that God's waiting room, you know, and I feel that, would you want to go into a system where you can never be yourself? You think about what people have done. You've got veterans, you've got people who have had a whole life of, you know, this wonderful life, and then they get to a care home and it means nothing. And for me, I think if we could share the care system as a whole, doesn't matter if it's old people, young people, needs to change right across the board.
But I think
you're right, but sadly, it does come down to money. There are more and more older people, there's fewer younger people, they're not earning money.
The homes that they've worked for all of their lives. Having said that, because it is so ridiculously expensive, it was cheaper. I think somebody we know in our team here is paying $1,500 a week for their dad. This was a grand a week for Ella to come. But those of you who've watched the show this week will know that I've just come off this cruise, and there were a couple of people on there who it is the same price for them to go on a cruise and keep going round the world. And they've got all of the things, and if I did that, and then I'd just say, and if I pop me clogs, chuck me over the side. But I think it's a great idea, or get all your friends together. We could have like a Loose Women Shady Pines.
Can you imagine that?
Yes, can you imagine?
I was just about to say I quite fancy a care home, but I've just changed my mind. Yeah, but it was interesting what you were saying about it was a privilege for you to look after your dad. And it was a privilege also for me that we were supported by some of the most wonderful people who helped care for my mum and dad. But because my kids are younger, I have this thing, well, do you know what? I will go in a care home because I don't want to blight their lives with, you know, looking after me. So it's...
Well, Lincoln's 15 years younger, so I've married my carer, so I...